Richard Gere built a career that many actors could only dream of, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood for decades. He had fame, wealth, and a reputation as a leading man who seemed to have everything under control. But behind that image, his life tells a very different story, one shaped by hunger, isolation, broken relationships, and choices that quietly cost him his place at the top. Even at 75, the weight of those experiences hasn't faded. What looks like success from the outside hides a life that has been far more complicated than most people realize. The hunger behind the dream. Long before Richard Gere became a global star, his reality was far removed from the polished image people would later associate with him. In the early years of his career in New York, he wasn't struggling in a symbolic way. He was struggling in the most basic sense. He has openly admitted that during the 1970s, he often didn't have enough money to eat. Even though he was already working in theater, including off-Broadway productions, the pay was so minimal that food became a luxury rather than a daily certainty. Eggs became his default meal because they were cheap, and eating at restaurants wasn't even something he considered possible. That period shaped him in ways that never fully left. While many actors look back on their early struggles as a stepping stone, Gere described those years as desperate and exhausting. Hunger wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a constant condition. He later connected those experiences to his long-term support for food charities, especially organizations focused on redistributing unused food to people in need. For him, this wasn't a symbolic cause. It was personal memory. The turning point came when he landed his breakout role in American Gigolo. For the first time, he was paid a significant amount, around $350,000, along with a share of future profits. That single paycheck marked the end of years of financial instability almost overnight. But what followed was something more complicated than a simple rise to fame. Instead of relief alone, there was a lingering awareness of how fragile success could be. What makes this phase of his life particularly significant is how it contrasts with what came later. As he transitioned into leading roles and became a major box office draw, the public saw confidence and control. But internally, the memory of those early years stayed with him. It created a mindset where success didn't feel permanent and comfort didn't feel entirely earned. This early chapter is essential to understanding everything that followed. Because while fame eventually solved his financial problems, it did nothing to resolve the deeper sense of instability that had already taken root. And as his career grew, those internal struggles would begin to surface in ways that even success couldn't hide. Fame didn't fix what was already broken. By the time Richard Gere became one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men, the assumption was that he had finally reached a point of stability. Films like An Officer and A Gentleman and Pretty Woman didn't just make him successful. They defined him as a symbol of confidence, control, and romantic charisma. But what the public couldn't see was that his internal struggles had never disappeared. In fact, they became more pronounced as his visibility increased. From a young age, Gere had already experienced a deep sense of alienation. He later described this feeling as a kind of disconnection from the world, something that began in his teenage years and stayed with him long into adulthood. Even when his career reached its peak, that underlying tension didn't fade. Instead, it intensified under the pressure of constant attention. The more successful he became, the more uncomfortable he felt being watched, analyzed, and defined by others. At a time when most actors would have leaned into their fame, Gere began pulling away from it. He openly admitted that he didn't like the level of attention that came with being a major star. Rather than chasing bigger roles and larger audiences, he started making deliberate choices to step back. This wasn't a temporary phase or a strategic career move. It was a personal reaction to something he found overwhelming. He described himself as reacting like a wild animal, resisting the spotlight instead of embracing it. This shift had real consequences. In an industry built on visibility and momentum, stepping back often means being replaced. While Gere was still working, he began to move away from the kinds of projects that had once defined his success. He chose smaller films, more character-driven roles, and projects that aligned with his personal beliefs rather than commercial expectations. To the public, it looked like a subtle change. Behind the scenes, it was a turning point that quietly altered the trajectory of his career. At the same time, he was searching for something that fame clearly couldn't provide. That search led him to Buddhism, which became a central part of his life. His spiritual path wasn't a passing interest. It was a response to years of internal conflict. Through it, he began to redefine success in terms that had nothing to do with box office numbers or public recognition. But this choice came with a cost. By stepping out of the mainstream and rejecting the traditional path of a Hollywood leading man, Gere began to distance himself from the system that had made him famous. And while it gave him a sense of purpose, it also set the stage for a series of decisions that would later limit his opportunities in ways he may not have fully anticipated. The speech that changed everything. If Richard Gere's withdrawal from fame had been a personal decision, what happened next turned it into something much bigger. In 1993, during one of the most watched events in the world, he made a choice that would quietly reshape the rest of his career. While presenting an award at the Academy Awards, Gere went off script and used his time on stage to speak about human rights abuses in China and call for Tibet's independence. It wasn't a vague statement or a passing comment. He directly addressed the situation and even referenced Chinese leadership, fully aware that millions were watching. In that moment, he wasn't acting as a celebrity trying to maintain his image. He was speaking as someone who had already committed himself to activism and was willing to take risks for it. But the consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Although he was not officially banned from Hollywood, the impact of that speech followed him for years. He was no longer seen as a safe choice for major productions, especially at a time when the global film market was beginning to rely heavily on international audiences, including China. His stance also led to him being permanently banned from entering China, one of the largest and fastest-growing film markets in the world. For major studios, that alone was enough to reconsider casting decisions. Gere himself later acknowledged that his political views had made him less desirable for blockbuster roles. It wasn't something openly discussed in the industry, but the pattern became clear. While other actors continued to move into bigger franchises and global projects, Gere's opportunities in that space began to shrink. What makes this chapter particularly significant is that it wasn't the result of a mistake or a scandal. It was a deliberate choice rooted in his beliefs. He never walked it back or tried to repair the damage by distancing himself from his views. Instead, he accepted the consequences and continued to support the same causes, including his ongoing advocacy for Tibet and his work with international humanitarian organizations. At the same time, he didn't disappear. Instead, he shifted further into independent films, where he found roles that allowed him to explore more complex characters. His performance in Arbitrage is often cited as one of the strongest of his career, earning him critical recognition and another major award nomination. But even as he received praise, the scale of his projects remained noticeably different from what it had been during his peak years. This period reveals a different kind of loss, one that isn't tied to failure, but to conviction. Gere didn't lose his career overnight, but he did lose access to a certain level of influence and visibility. And unlike many actors who fight to stay at the center of the industry, he chose to accept that trade-off, even if it meant becoming a quieter presence in a system he once dominated. Love, loss, and the cost of a private life. While Richard Gere's professional life was quietly shifting, his personal life was unfolding with a different kind of intensity, one that was far less controlled and often more painful. His first high-profile marriage to Cindy Crawford was, from the beginning, built on unstable ground. The relationship had already been under public scrutiny due to their age difference, but what made it more difficult was the way it started. Their wedding was spontaneous, rushed, and far from what Crawford had imagined. Something she later admitted left her feeling unsettled even on the day it happened. That early imbalance never fully resolved, and over time, it created distance between them. As their marriage progressed, speculation began to surround the couple, including rumors questioning their relationship and motives. Both publicly denied those claims, emphasizing their commitment and denying any narrative that their marriage was for publicity. But the pressure of constant scrutiny, combined with their different lifestyles and expectations, slowly eroded the relationship. When they eventually separated and finalized their divorce, Gere described the experience as deeply painful, something that took him years to process. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was a public unraveling that forced him to confront both personal and emotional vulnerabilities. His second marriage, to Carrie Lowell, initially appeared more grounded. They shared a son, Homer, and for a time their life together seemed stable. But beneath that surface, differences began to emerge. Gere preferred a quieter, more isolated lifestyle, while Lowell was more connected to a social and public environment. Those opposing preferences gradually created tension that neither could ignore. When they separated, the breakup did not resolve quickly. Instead, it turned into a prolonged legal battle that stretched over several years, centered around financial disputes involving an estimated $45 million fortune. What made this divorce particularly difficult was not just the money, but the duration and intensity of the conflict. For years, their separation remained unresolved, keeping both of them tied to a situation that prevented closure. Even though there were efforts to maintain stability for their son, the legal process itself became a source of ongoing stress. When the settlement was finally reached, it ended a chapter that had taken a significant emotional toll. During these years, Gere also faced a series of physical setbacks that added another layer of strain. A horseback riding accident resulted in a broken hand, forcing him to walk home alone without assistance after being thrown from his horse. Later, while filming a fight scene, he insisted on performing his own stunt despite concerns, ultimately dislocating his shoulder and halting production for weeks. These incidents reflected a pattern, an unwillingness to step back, even when the risks were clear. At the same time, he found himself at the center of an international controversy after an AIDS awareness event in India, where a public gesture intended to promote health awareness led to legal charges of obscenity. The situation escalated quickly, drawing criticism and protests, and highlighting how cultural differences could turn a well-meaning act into a major public issue. Although the charges were eventually dismissed, the experience added another layer of tension to an already complicated period in his life. Finding peace after a lifetime of conflict. As Richard Gere moved into his later years, the challenges he had faced began to take on a different meaning. The losses became more personal and unavoidable, especially when his mother passed away at the age of 91. Although he rarely spoke publicly about grief, those who followed his life closely understood how deeply that loss affected him. He had often described his parents as compassionate, grounded people who shaped his values, and their long marriage had been something he quietly hoped to replicate in his own life. Losing his mother wasn't just a personal moment, it was a reminder of the kind of stability he had struggled to maintain. That sense of reflection deepened again when his father passed away at the age of 100. Gere had always spoken about his father with admiration, describing him as a man who approached even his profession with a sense of service and purpose. His father's involvement in community work, including decades of support for charitable programs, left a lasting impression on him. In many ways, Gere's own commitment to humanitarian work can be traced directly back to that influence. But with both parents gone, he was left carrying those values forward alone, without the presence of the people who had originally instilled them in him. At the same time, his health became a more immediate concern. During a family trip, he was hospitalized with pneumonia, a condition that can be especially dangerous for someone in their 70s. The illness didn't just affect him, it spread through his family, turning what was meant to be a celebration into a prolonged period of recovery. While he ultimately regained his health, the experience served as a reminder that physical resilience has limits, no matter how strong someone may appear. Yet, despite everything, this stage of his life also brought a kind of stability that had eluded him for decades. His marriage to Alejandra Silva marked a significant shift, not because it was free of challenges, but because it was built on shared values rather than external expectations. Their relationship, which began after years of knowing each other, developed into something that felt grounded and intentional. Together, they built a family that included children from previous relationships, as well as 2 sons of their own, creating a blended household that reflected a different kind of success, one that wasn't tied to fame or public approval. Their decision to relocate to Spain further emphasized that change. Instead of remaining in the center of Hollywood, Gere chose to prioritize family, culture, and a quieter environment for his children. It was a deliberate move away from the world that had once defined him and towards something more personal. The fact that his children are being raised bilingual and connected to a broader cultural identity speaks to the kind of life he is now trying to build. In the end, what defines this phase is not a dramatic comeback or a return to the spotlight, but a gradual shift toward peace. After years marked by hunger, internal conflict, public controversy, and personal loss, Gere's life has settled into something far less visible, but arguably more meaningful. It's not the kind of ending that draws headlines, but it reflects a reality that many people overlook, that sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones. Richard Gere's life shows that success doesn't erase struggle. It just hides it better. Looking at his journey, do you think he made the right choices stepping away from fame, or did it cost him too much? Let me know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.